isn't it? How?
Honestly, I don't know. The robots keep calling it a revitalization cycle, but it's not something I'd ever heard of or knew was possible.
What is this place?
A fortress, built to keep me isolated during this process.
Does he have to just stand there like that? It's creeping me out.
He's just trying to protect me.
Then why was he drawing energy from you while you were in the pod?
Quite the reverse. Kal-El was the one absorbing ion radiation from the Eradicator as part of the revitalization cycle.
Highly advanced tech, programmed to protect my people.
So he decides to put on a cape and dispense his own brand of justice? I'm just saying. Well, I can't tell you how glad I am to see you again. There's a lot you need to know.
These broadcasts have brought me up to speed. Darkseid killed my friends, and people are being turned into monsters by that cyborg imposter.
Hey, Kenshaw.
The astronaut? I thought he was dead. I guess I didn't know everything.
There's a lot of that going around. So, what's the plan, Dad?
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast, and joining me today to talk about a double feature movie, we'll be talking about The Death and Return of Superman, which was the 2018 and 2019 Death of Superman and Reign of the Supermen animated features, is returning guest Tyler Patrick. Tyler, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you, sir?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm glad we were finally able to get this together. We had to play a bit of email tag back and forth to try and get this one worked out.
Oh, I mean, it's crazy because, life happens and that just alters so much. So,
yeah.
When I saw this on your list, I was like, my first time I came on, we chatted like The Crow, Salvation, because I just wanted to talk about something a little bit different. But then when I saw this, I was like, okay. That's kind of my thing, Superman stuff. So I was like, yep, got to go with Perry on this one.
Well, I had been holding this for someone else, but, it just never ended up happening. So I decided to put it up on the list, and like almost immediately as soon as I put it on the list, like you snapped it up. So it did not last on there very long. But before we dive too much into that, why don't you remind people about who you are, what you do?
So I host the Krypton Report podcast. It is a Superman based podcast, but we really talk all things DC. We've been going for, this will be our 10th year. We started just reviewing the TV show Supergirl, and then it just kind of morphed more into an all things Superman, super related podcast. And, it's kind of cool doing this with you this year. Having just had a version of the death on TV, and then this being what I've dubbed the year of Superman because of the new film. We've been trying to do some special things and a little bit different this year. So it's nice to get over here and discuss this with you.
Yes, this is going to be the year of Superman, and it is well timed because we did have a version of this story on Superman and Lois at the end of the end of the third season, crossing over to the beginning of the fourth season. Which people are mixed on how they handled that, and I'm sure we can talk about that some other time. I think actually I might be scheduled to be talking about this a little bit on your show later on this year. So
you'll be coming on discussing. This year, yes, sir.
So we'll be talking about, we'll dive into that a little bit later. And eventually, I am hoping to eventually cover Superman and Lois in some form, but with the episode count per seasons, and just like it takes some logistical things to figure out for that.
I understand that completely.
Yeah. So obviously, you host the Krypton Report podcast. So obviously you are a Superman fan. But before we dive too much into the movie, what's interesting you lately? Anything that's grabbing your attention these days?
Let's see. Well, I did finish just recently from my friend's podcast, Gravely Amusing. It's a kind of it's a horror based podcast, but it's more about horror from a approach of literature and folklore than just horror, like film review stuff. And we did like a crossover kind of thing because we taught Creature Commandos, because you have some classic traditional horror based creatures in there. And before that, we were kind of just doing all around James Gunn discussion. So I rewatched The Suicide Squad and Peacemaker, going into that conversation. The wife and I just watched Cross on Amazon Prime. Really enjoyed just the refreshing detective story. And I'm really excited that Severance is back for season 2. I was late to that show, but I subscribed to Apple because my wife and I enjoy Shrinking. And then I was like, you know what? I still got this. I'm going to try this. And I'm really excited. I haven't watched the start of the second season yet, but that's kind of just where, I've been like watching things. And Solomon, my son and I started watching Skeleton Crew on just for Star Wars. We're the first episode in and he's digging it. And you know what? That's what it's there for, right? Like it really is to help spark the children. So I'm watching it through his lens more than I am my own. So,
I see this online sometimes when people are complaining about stuff that's geared for the more younger audiences. I'm like, well, we've got all our stuff. We've got so much stuff to deal with. Let's have some stuff so that we can nurture the next generation. Like my son and my daughter too, to a lesser extent, are really into Spidey and His Amazing Friends on Disney Plus. They love that show. My son has that thing on repeat, basically. Like he's watched both seasons, not a few times already. And he still loves it. He gets a kick out of it. He starts singing along with the theme song and everything. And it's not my thing, but I love that that's something there for him, because now as he gets older, he's only like 2.5 now. But as he gets older, now I can transition him into the stuff that I like more. And then we could talk about that kind of stuff. So that's what I'm really looking forward to with all these things.
Exactly. Like that's always been my thing, is like, you got to make something for, I don't want like teens and adults, but you got to make something for the little kids to help cultivate that next generation of fans, that interest, that something that they'll grow up and be interested in, because that's how, you keep these properties alive.
Exactly. And I remember when I was a kid, it was the 87 Ninja Turtles cartoon that got me into stuff. And, that was very watered down compared to the comic book, obviously. Oh, yeah. But that show, and even like when I look back on it now, I'm like, oh my God, this is pretty cringe. But back then I ate it up with a spoon, and that made me a Turtles fan for life. And then because there were other stuff that was higher levels of maturity, as I grew up, I was able to keep that flame alive. And I think it's the same thing with a lot of these other properties. Exactly.
My children, so just to give you, my son just turned 10. On January 12th. And I say that because I know your child has had a birthday too. And because of our time
my daughter turned 4 on January 13th. Yeah.
Okay. Because of our time difference, I was like, I couldn't tell which day it was, but I thought that was kind of cool. They were right there together. And my daughter will be turning 8 in a couple of months. So I say that because they really enjoyed watching my adventures with Supermen. And, I always try to look at things with an appreciation of, am I enjoying this at all? And having my kids, like, are they enjoying it? Because I get enjoyment from them, but then it actually made them more into the Superman fandom stuff. Because I tell them all the time, like, look, this is what I like. If you don't like it, I'm okay with that. You like what you like. Like, my son is a huge Godzilla fan. Like, he found Godzilla on his own. And when I mean Godzilla, I mean all facets of Godzilla. Like, I have the box set of all the old dubbed movies, and him and I will sit and watch those. He loves it all. My daughter loves Scooby-Doo. She will watch, and these are things that, yes, I like them too, but my kids really like them on their own, and we share, things that we're interested in. But My Adventures was something that for them that they got into.
Yeah.
And I love that, because it got to the point where Solomon would be like, oh, Dad, you know what today is? New My Adventures. And that just made me smile, because that's what we want. We want something for the kids. And I've said this a lot, but it breaks my heart that something like My Adventures, which is so good, there's no merch for it. Because if they had toys of this show and stuff like that, you'd be getting all my money. Because I'd have to buy one for me, one for the kids, one for me. Justice League Action, I thought was a great show. The kids enjoyed. They were a little too small when that first came, but we've watched it over time. They have some toys from that. My daughter enjoyed the DC Superhero Girls, but that show just kind of came and went. And now it's not streaming. You can't buy the first season. And luckily I bought the second season when it came out. So, that helped her like things. But these properties that we like, that we want to share, also my daughter loves Ninja Turtles. And, they both really love the newest movie, but they've liked the previous Nickelodeon series a lot as well. And that's how we keep these things that you and I like alive, is by making versions that the kids can latch on to. So that's my little rant.
Exactly.
We have to cultivate for the children as well as keep something alive for us, or these properties don't survive.
Yeah, all the gatekeeping around modern fandom just drives me up the wall, because I remember when I was in, junior high and high school, and it's like, I would have killed for people to be talking about Spider-Man and the Avengers and X-Men and all that kind of stuff back then. But nobody talked about that stuff. Nobody was interested in it. And now it's happening. And you got all these people who grew up wishing we had those types of things around, and now they're complaining that too many people are interested in this stuff.
Yeah, I'm like, you know what, whatever. I'm just like, I'm glad they're interested. I'm glad they're finding. So my son and I were talking today about Sonic things, and he was talking about, if I did a Sonic game, or he was kind of pitching me an idea for a show, and we were talking, and I was like, the one thing you got to understand is with fandom, some people approach it differently. There are people, I said, who your mom and I have interacted with, who said they're Batman fans, but they just knew the Nolan trilogy. There's people we've met who like Batman, who are really just into the Arkham games. So you can't assume just because somebody likes a property that they're a fan of the whole thing. So if you're making something, you want to be able to touch the different areas of fandom so that they live on in some way. I love comics. I love reading comics. I've tried to instill that in my kids, and they read things, books and comics as well. But sometimes people don't read like that as much. So having games and cartoons and web series or whatever is a way for these characters to live on. So that when I have grandchildren, they're like, Superman. I'm like, yes.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I've had guests on the show who, their only knowledge of superheroes is just from the movies of the TV show. And that's how you discovered it. That's how you're keeping it. Whether or not you ever read a comic book in your life, at least this is some way that this stuff is getting passed on and introduced to more people. And I think that's awesome. So yeah, I completely agree with you on all of that. I mean, my wife, she is never going to read a comic book. She's just not going to happen. It's just like the language barrier and all that. Like, even if I give her like a one that's been translated into Japanese, I still don't know if she would read it, but she'll watch the movies. She'll watch the movies with me. She's the one who wanted to go take a day off so we could go see Deadpool and Wolverine together when the kids were at preschool. So, nice. That's the kind of thing that, I mean, our first date, she told me that she didn't like superhero movies, and I showed her Guardians of the Galaxy. After that, she wanted to see the next one, and then I got her into the MCU. So yeah, I mean, getting more people into this stuff is definitely important, however that happens. So I totally agree with you on all of that. Now, as for my part, it's funny you mentioned Creature Commandos, because I had just finished that series, and man, I dug the hell out of that show. I wasn't expecting. Sorry, go ahead.
No. Did you binge it all or watch it weekly?
Oh, I binged it. I just got my access to it now, and I just binged the whole thing.
So two of my friends who rewatched it just straight through said that's the way to watch it, that it just works so much better watching it straight like a long movie than the weekly. So I plan that just rewatch it probably with my wife and just watch it straight through.
Yeah, I mean, I split it up over like the course of a few nights, but yeah, basically straight through, more or less. Yeah, I love the hell of it. And I'm not I have no familiarity with the Creature Commandos. I've never read any of the DC Frankenstein stuff, Agent of Shade, or anything like that. I picked up the Creature Commandos trade when it came on sale because of this show, but I haven't actually read it yet. So I had no familiarity going in with any of these characters other than Amanda Waller, and that was it. And yeah, I dug it. I thought it was so much fun. It was this shows what a bad parent I am. My kids were watching parts of it with me.
No, your kids are still small in that age where they don't pick up on stuff, and they'll just like it can just wash over them. Because I mean, there's times I would watch stuff. My son was, let's see, in 2020 was 5. But before then, like when I was at home with him, I'd watch stuff no matter what, and they just didn't pay attention. And now they're in the ages where they focus on like, what you watching? Adult show, can't watch it, kids. Okay. Because now they'll like actually pay attention. You're like, yeah, can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, I'm kind of torn on that whole thing because on the one hand, I'm kind of nervous about that stuff. On the other hand, I'm the kid who watched like RoboCop and Alien 3 when I was like 9. So.
Yeah, I tell the story like for my birthday. I don't know. I'd have to do the math. Maybe I was, I don't know, 7, maybe. That makes sense. I got Terminator 2 toys, for my birthday. And, and I'm like, I had a RoboCop toy and I watched RoboCop and you're just kind of like, huh.
Yeah, it was the late 80s, early 90s was a weird time to be a kid because all this stuff that was clearly for adults was also very obviously marketed towards children. I had those. I remember those Terminator 2 toys. I think I went as the Terminator in elementary school, like 3rd grade or something, as a costume. I remember there was a Rambo cartoon, there was a RoboCop cartoon, all this kind of stuff was out there.
It's like,
it was
yeah,
it was a weird time. But anyway, today, like I said, we are talking about the Death and Return of Superman, the basically 2-part film, but they're released as in 2 halves, which DC does with a lot of their longer animated stuff. And obviously, the closest adaptation we've gotten yet to the Death of Superman and Reign of the Supermen story. We did have the Superman Doomsday animated film back in the early 2000s, which kind of tried to fit everything, and it mostly focused on the death aspect, and it didn't really go into the Reign stuff, and it tried to squeeze it all into like 90 minutes, which mixed results, I feel.
Yeah,
and then we also had
my co-host James and I just back in December. We did a commentary track that we released for free on our Patreon of that film. And yeah, I like the Doomsday stuff, like but once that fight's over, I'm kind of checked out of that movie.
Yeah. I
mean, there's a couple of good scenes with Lois, but for the most part.
And I think James Marsters, if I remember, did the voice of Lex Luthor, and I thought he did a pretty good job. But other than that,
he did. Not
much else to say about that. And then, of course, obviously Batman v Superman kind of shoehorned in the Death of Superman at the end there, which I absolutely despised how they did that. And, we had Doomsday on Smallville as well, again, with mixed results.
Yep.
So this has been a story that hasn't really kind of gotten its due yet. And like we said, on Superman and Lois too, most recently, which again, mixed results with how they handled that aspect of it. But this is kind of like the first straight adaptation we got of this story, which is kind of surprising because this is one of the biggest Superman stories out there. I think most modern Superman fans, this is a big touchstone for them. And it's funny how the opinion of this story has evolved over time, because I remember reading comics in the 90s, like the Death of Superman was held up as this example of like comics. What's the word? Like running out of ideas. That was this was kind of like held up as this was the point where comics really started running out of ideas, and classic fans and all that, they had lambasted the Death of Superman story and the Reign of the Supermen, and then same thing with then Nightfall as well, same type of criticism. That you had the Clone Saga stuff and the Spider-Man books, all these, also the Emerald Twilight with Green Lantern and all that kind of stuff. So all this kind of stuff was happening around this time as a way of like reinventing these classic superheroes for the 90s audiences with very much mixed results. And it's funny because looking back on it now, I do think it's kind of interesting how the people who grew up reading those stories, now they're like our age, and they look back at it and they hold these up as like examples of, well, maybe not the Clone Saga so much, but people do love Ben Reilly still.
Yeah, I actually really, I have my own reasons for why I really do like Ben Reilly, but I agree with you. I think it goes back to like we were saying at the beginning. You have that generational thing of what you like when you with a kid, and it evolves. And we grew up with that era, and we look back at it as being these great stories. But and eventually, it'll happen again and again, and with as the next generation comes up. So
yeah. And another good example of this was when all the New 52 stuff was happening, and all the fans who'd been such big fans of the post-crisis stuff were complaining about it. I remember thinking at the time, like, well, they kind of did this before. You guys just weren't around when they did it the last time. And the pre-crisis fans were the ones who were pissed off last time. So it's just these things go in cycles. You just kind of got to roll with these different things. But let's first talk about the Death of Superman story a little bit. What is your history with this story?
So I remember when it came out as a kid, and I read part of it, because I've talked before. There wasn't any, for the longest time, there was no comic shop near where we lived. Then they opened one. And when they did, I'd find what I could. But, a lot of the comics at the time was just those books that the X-Men were really popular because you had the cartoon and everything. And then Spider-Man was popular because of the cartoon. And so you had those stories and you're going to the comic shop, but like you just said, what do you call it? A lot of the stories were up here, and for a child, some of it was really difficult to process. But with the Death, that last book is basically splash pages, so I was able to look at that, and like that last issue is what I remember. And then years later, I read the actual, story, and I did the whole Death of Superman and then the funeral for a friend part. And then, of course, you have the different interpretations we've talked about. And what's funny is I've always complained that I feel like so many times with Superman, do the people who have the character like don't know what to do with Superman, and the only way to make him relevant is to kill him. And it makes me very angry because like the stories they always want to tell, like these stories of killing off Superman. But it's funny because this film that we're going to talk about is actually my favorite Superman movie.
Oh, okay. Wow, that's a high bar there. I would not call it my favorite. I do think it's I think it's really good, but I wouldn't call it my favorite.
And I would say the first, like, every time I watch it, I do the double feature because I had the individual copies and then I bought it all together. But the first part, just the death part, is my favorite because I feel like it is they took the story of the death of Superman, they shrunk it down, they hit the beats that were most important, and they found a way to mix the different errors. But they, because when the death came around, we didn't have the regular Justice League. But in this, you have the actual Justice League, and you have a great emotional beats between the story of Lois and Superman in this film. So I really enjoy the death part. The rain part I do like a lot too, but the death one, because it really focuses, because this film was part of the continuity. I don't know if we ever got a title for like with this era, but starting with Justice League. I believe
it was like the DCAU or DCUA or something like that. I can't remember, or something like that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, DCUAO, DC Universe Animated Original Movie Line is what it was called.
Yeah, that's an extremely long time.
I know.
But it started with the Flashpoint Paradox and went until technically, I guess you could say it went until the it was supposed to be Justice League the Dark Side War, but then you find out it actually plays into when they did the Tomorrowverse films and everything. But it's this long run of films that are all in most of the same voice cast, very similar to the same animation style. They tweak it a little bit as they go, but they all connect together. So you had a little bit of history with this Superman by the time we got to the death. So it wasn't like you were just being introduced to this new version. We'd already, had some journeys and adventures with this character. So it just worked that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my part of this story was I wasn't reading comics regularly in 92, but I was I'd been introduced to them through, the X-Men and Batman by that point. So I'd been sampling stuff here and there from like the library and things like that. Every now and then pick up a random issue from like the newsstand or the drugstore. But I hadn't been a regular comic book reader at this time. And I remember, I think I read The Death of Superman in graphic novel form. I think it was something I read at the library or something. And then not too long after that, they had The Reign of Superman, like this big trade paperback. It was a thick book. You could like beat someone over the head with it. And it was like, I begged my parents or my grandparents to buy it for me. So they bought it for me. And I read that thing from cover to cover several times. And I was lost a lot of the time because I did not know who Guy Gardner was. I didn't know who Hal Jordan was or any of these characters who were popping up. I didn't know who Mongol was. I couldn't understand why Supergirl was like this weird transforming thing. So there's a lot of stuff that I had just zero context for. But when you're a kid, you don't really care. You just keep going.
Yeah. I've talked about like there was a birthday. I don't remember how old I was, but I just got my aunt and uncle just bought me a big thing of comics. And I remember a lot of the covers, and it was a lot of the right before the death of Superman, and Batman comics. And I remember the covers and the stories. And that's when I first discovered Nightwing, because I didn't know that Robin had died and we had a different Robin at that time and everything. And I remember reading one that was the Matrix Supergirl and just being confused as to what this is, because at that time, my cousin, she was a big fan of the Supergirl movie, and I had seen that. So that was my context for that character. So when I'm reading the comic and they have this, I'm lost, like you said, like, what?
I remember my first discovery of Nightwing as well. It was there was an action figure line called Legends of the Dark Knight, and they had a Nightwing figure in it. And I'm like, who is this guy? I have no idea who this guy is. And then later it was I remember it very clearly. It was Robin number 0, part of the 0 Hour Beginning of Tomorrow event. And it was this issue with Nightwing and Robin, and Nightwing was telling Dick Grayson was telling Tim stories about when he was Robin and all this. And I'm just like, wait a minute, that guy's Dick Grayson from Batman, the 66, and from the animated series, he's Nightwing? What's going on here? And this other Robin, this is a completely different guy? What? So it blew my mind when I was a kid when I found that out.
It was pretty, it was interesting. You just have this, you're like, what? Hey, what? Who? And a lot of it's because you brought up libraries. I think libraries, I've talked about that a lot, are very important. We utilize them now. And I did, like, when the New 52 happened, I went to the library and got everything. Like, I was probably about 6 months behind just because I didn't have any access to comics. But I got, trade paperbacks in my library. I also got individual issues, and I just read everything. Can never undervalue the library.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, going into this movie, like you said, it is your favorite movie. I also lean towards you with The Death of Superman. I do think that is the better one. Also, a bit more of a faithful translation. When they get into Reign of the Supermen, then I think they felt like they had to fit it more into the ongoing continuity so you involve Darkseid and Apocalypse and all that kind of stuff, mixing that in there. And there are some beats and stuff that they shortened, obviously, for runtime, because again, like I said, that Reign of the Superman story, that is massive. Like, again, it was like this thick. I think now they sell it in 2 versions.
Because you have 4 leading characters, and I always feel like the Eradicator is like one of the hardest characters to nail down. And I feel like the way they present the Eradicator in this, it works really well. And definitely in the second half, they make some changes to the story that works to tie it into the ongoing continuity, which works, as you watch the entire integrated works. So, and I mean, you had Peter Tomasi write the script for the first one, so that's just really good right there.
Yeah. But I do think one of the biggest drawbacks of this movie, and this was also a complaint I had about both Hush and the Long Halloween, is you've got these classic stories. And what I really wish they had done is, instead of shoehorning them into these different animated universes and trying to make them work with the existing continuity, I kind of wish they had done what they used to do, where they would take these stories and they would just more or less adapt them as they were in the comics. Yeah. And you could change some things too, obviously. Like, instead of having the weird 90s Justice League, instead you could have the Big Seven there instead of that. Probably like a bit more, nipping and tucking here and there about the Hank Henshaw stuff and all that, so it makes more sense. But I think that one of the downsides is that it's so tied to that New 52 style, and we're not getting like the classic Superman look in this.
That is true. That, what I think is interesting is when they do Cyborg Superman, they gave him more of the look of what was it, the New 52 at the time. When Superman appears at the end, after dying and everything, when he comes back, he is in his, at the time of the comics was his Superman Reborn outfit, where it's a lighter blue. He still doesn't have the trunks, but he has the red belt and which I really like that suit. So they, brought it into what was current in the comics at the time. And then I think he only appears like one or two more times in the films with that suit. But the Hush one was one that got me, because that one I think shouldn't have been in continuity. I think this worked well as part of the continuity.
Surprisingly, they managed to make it work pretty well, but yeah, some of the choices they made with these continuity was just a little bit weird, because you had Son of Batman with Damian being introduced, but then you also have the Justice League one, which introduces them as the first time as the Justice League. So it's like this, just like the New 52 itself, it was like this weird disconnect between, okay, well, when in the timeline are these different things happening? It's kind of hard to figure that all out. But I think they did interesting things here, like tying in John Henry Irons with Star Labs and Cyborg's father. I thought was a really nice way to work them together. I thought this also had the unenviable task of reconciling the fact that in Death of Superman, he is with Lois, but in the original comics, but in the New 52 movies before this, they'd established the Wonder Woman connection. So they had to kind of figure out a way to work through that. And I thought they did that surprisingly well. They actually handled that in a pretty decent job with the conversation between Diana and Lois in, Reign of the Supermen part.
I agree. You have the little dialogue between Superman and Wonder Woman where he states to her, like, why things didn't work out between them. And it just was like, it was comforting, and it was like, okay, because you got to think the first Justice League War came out in, I want to say 2013 or 2014.
I believe it was around that time. Yeah.
It was either late 2013 or early 2014, because by the time it came out, we'd already been 2 years into the New 52. And by the time we got to this death story, we were already in our rebirth phase in the comics. So they had to trying to catch up a little bit more with where comics were. So
it was February 2014.
Okay.
And but yeah, speaking of, I think the voice cast in this also stellarly cast in this. I mean, we brought back Nathan Fillion as Hal Jordan. I thought that was a great idea. Cress Williams, most people know him as Black Lightning on TV, but he played Steel in this, and John Henry Irons.
I got to have the honor of I got to interview him a year ago.
Cool.
In late 2023, I got to do a interview with him, and we talked about this and with it, and I think he does a great job as Steel.
But also Rebecca Romijn, I thought was a great choice for Lois Lane, and same with Rosario Dawson as Wonder Woman. Both of them, I thought, did a really stellar job with those two.
Well, the fact that Superman and Wonder Woman, when this universe started in Justice League War, they were voiced by different actors. And then I think it's by Thrones of Atlantis, we get Jerry O'Connell as Superman and Rosario Dawson as Wonder Woman. And I think what really helps in the voice acting is you have Jerry O'Connell and Rebecca Romijn, who are married in real life, as
Lois I didn't know that.
And Clark. Yeah. And that really brings, I think there's an extra dynamic in just the delivery of the lines with that you really help buy them together.
Yeah. Surprisingly too, Rainn Wilson, I would not expect that, but I thought he did a pretty good job as Lex.
I did too. There's nobody in the voice cast that I don't like.
Yeah, I'm looking over the cast and I can't there are people just okay, they do fine, but I don't have anything really to say about him. Like Jason O'Mara as Batman, he's done it for a while. He knows what he's doing there. I don't really have any real take on him one way or the other, but But yeah, it's either I've got really good things to say about them, or it's just it doesn't matter to me, basically.
Yeah.
The one thing, I do like Jerry O'Connell, but I think one of the problems with this movie is there doesn't feel like there's enough differentiation between his Superman and his Clark Kent. And part of that is also just the animation, but also part of it is I don't detect anything really different in his vocal performance, trying to use a higher pitch or something like that or anything.
And I think I agree with you. Other than the only point I'll make with that is watching who Clark interacts with. Because when we see Clark, it's Lois and it's his parents. We don't see Clark really interact with many other people. I'm trying to remember all the people because I feel like with the context of the story, he's trying to tell her subtly so we don't see as much Clark. If we got a scene, I bet, of Clark interacting with Kat, it might play out differently. But we don't really see Clark interact with anybody but Lois and his parents. And I wonder if that's because, that they talk about how he acts around her and everything and trying to tell her and the struggle he's having is he's maybe dropping the Clark disguise a little bit to try to hopefully that she'll see him. But that could just be me.
No, that's a good point. I hadn't considered that, but yeah, I think that that does make sense in the context of the movie. But we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk more about these two films. Ever have a situation where you want to watch something on Netflix, but it's only available in a different country? Or are there websites you want to access, but they're blocked in your location? What you need is a VPN, or a virtual private network. A VPN is effectively your own superhero mask to protect your device's secret identity from the internet. Your IP address and all your data are encrypted, allowing you to browse the internet safely and securely. In these uncertain times, protecting what you do on the internet is more important than ever. But free VPNs available out there are not as secure as they claim, so you need a trusted service like ExpressVPN. I've been a loyal user of ExpressVPN for years. They offer the easiest experience, the fastest speeds, and the most responsive customer service I've ever dealt with. But the best part of ExpressVPN is that you can choose the country you're accessing the internet from, which lets you get around geo-blocking. So if you want to watch something that's only available on Netflix UK, you set your location in the UK and then you watch as much as you like. If you'd like to try out ExpressVPN, you can get 60 days of free usage by signing up using my referral link in the podcast description. Just click the link in the description to get started. Since you're listening to this show, I already know you love watching superhero movies and TV shows, and you just might enjoy superhero comics. But how about superhero novels? I'm giving away 2 free superhero novels and 1 free superhero short story. Visit percivalconstantine.com/SCP to get access to Vanguard, Heroes Forged, the first novel in my own Avengers and X-Men inspired superhero novel series, and Ronin Born, my cyberpunk superhero novel set in a futuristic Japan. I'm also throwing in Fire and Lightning, a free prequel story to my new Power Rangers inspired superhero series Omega Knights. So visit percivalconstantine.com/SCP, those are just the letters SCP, to get started, or click on the link in the show notes. And now, on with the show. And we are back, still talking about the death and return of Superman with Tyler Patrick. Now, one of the things I also liked about the first half was also because again, they had this task where they had to establish the fact that Lois and Clark are in a relationship. They also had to deal with the fact that she doesn't know he's Superman at this point. So they had all these things they had to kind of set up really quickly right in the beginning of the movie so that the drama when Superman dies hits her very hard. And it is like this. And it's funny because in a weird way, I think that almost works a little bit better for the character drama than it did in the comics, because she had known he was Superman for some period of time. I haven't read all the trial and error, but for some period of time she had known by this point. I think they were even engaged at this point. But for her to first find out he's Superman at a point where she thinks he's going to break up with her, right? Because she knows he's holding back. She knows there's something he is not telling her. And like even meeting his parents, he doesn't want to introduce her to his parents. So she feels like, okay, this relationship is on the rocks. It's about to end. And then she finds out what the truth is just that he's so terrified of telling her his secret that he's Superman. And so then they finally open up to each other, and then boom, Doomsday comes in and kills him. Like, it is incredibly tragic, I think, in that way.
I agree, because I think the three biggest like emotional beats in that is, or maybe four, he leaves her a note, says, "My last secret is I love you," as she hears him the boom of him flying off. And, and then she's now watching Superman, but now knowing it's Clark. And when Superman shows up to the battle, Wonder Woman's there, and she says, "Don't hold back. You can't hold back." So, like, we've already escalated the threat of Doomsday, where he's taking out the Justice League. He's taking out now Wonder Woman. So it is now Doomsday versus Superman. And then we get a beat where Lois is talking to him and she's talking about backup. He's like, "I am the backup. There is nobody else coming." And then you have the part where Doomsday's winning and Superman's down, and Lois throws the rocks at Doomsday, and he turns to see her, and she's, tears in her eyes, and she's basically ready to die trying to save him. And that's when, Superman takes off and breaks Doomsday's neck. Now we'll save that. I'll save that comment for later, because I feel like, I'll just say this. I feel like they've elevated Doomsday so much more in the comics now, especially in Superman and Lois, that, the way that Clark defeats Doomsday would not work. But it is, this, like you said, the drama moment now, of Doomsday walking to kill Lois and Superman just laying there, and she says, "I love you too." And it's his last act of just everything that he has to take Doomsday out. It hits harder because we had those emotional beats, and it's like and then he dies, saying, "What a lucky man it was to be loved by you." And they barely even got to really love each other. So I think this is part of just why I don't know. I love this story, is I feel the connection of the characters in this.
Well,
and how they did it.
Also too, I thought I love the conversation at the Watchtower or the Hall of Justice. I'm not sure where, I can't recall exactly where it is, but where they're all talking about, their relationships. And, when Barry's talking about getting married to Iris, and then Superman's like, "Well, does she know?" He's like, "Well, yeah, of course she knows. She's known for a while." It's like, what do you? And it's like the way
he's like, "You just spring that on her last minute."
And I thought that was a great, because and this made me think, comparing it to Superman Unbound, which we talked about a few months back. And one of the things that annoyed me about that movie was the way they handled that Lois and Clark relationship and the problems they were having, and his like overprotective nature of her, which came off, it didn't ring true to me in that movie the way they were trying to portray it. But his, reluctance to tell her his secret in this, I thought rang a lot more true and made much more sense as a character story that's backing up this superhero story.
I agree.
Now, I'd like to segue into focus more on the reign of Superman. Well, actually, one more thing I wanted to mention here is there's this character who keeps being mentioned in both movies as there's this female reporter named Sullivan. And I've been doing a Smallville rewatch on and off here. Do you think that's supposed to be a nod to Smallville? Is that supposed to be Chloe in this universe?
I would say so.
Okay, just wanted to mention
the part that always makes me break up, and even in the comics when I read it, is when Bibbo's praying. And he says, it ain't right that I get to keep on living and you took Superman. Like, and this is my favorite portrayal of Bibbo. I just want to throw out there, where he's got enough of like the old boxer sailor kind of person, but he's not the drunken kind of ignorant. Sometimes he was portrayed, and then not the fat, goofy guy that he was in the animated series. This is my favorite version of Bibbo.
Yeah. You know what? I'm going to take a stand here. I've never liked Bibbo as a character. Like every time he popped up in these comic books I was reading, he always just kind of irritated me. But I thought they used the right amount of him and they used him in the right way in this.
That's why he's my favorite, because I agree with you.
Yeah.
I don't think he's ever been done really well until this.
Yeah. So let's transition. Well, you said you want to mention about the final blow that Superman uses to kill Doomsday. So why don't you I'll give you your 5 minutes to rant about that before we segue into Reign of the Supermen.
He just, summons all his strength and he flies as hard as he can at Doomsday and basically punches Doomsday in the chin. It spins his head around and breaks his neck, and that's what kills him. And while doing that, Doomsday stabs him with his bone claw that we saw growing, that he was going to stab Lois. And it's a great moment, because it really is. You see, it's that last like umph of everything that he has. Like, this is it. If this doesn't work, there's nothing else. So yeah, it's just, it gets you.
All right, so now I want to segue into the Reign of the Supermen side of things. So I was really excited for this because we get all four Supermen on screen for the first time, because like we said, they had a clone of Superman in the Superman Doomsday story, but it wasn't like, it wasn't Superboy. It was just this more of like a Bizarro type thing at best. And you didn't have like any of these other characters in there. We didn't have any of the, we did have Superboy pop up on Smallville, but it wasn't as part of like a Death of Superman story as well. Also, same thing in, Superman and Lois. We had Superboy. We had two Superboys. In fact, we had Steel. But we didn't have, when we had the Eradicator too in a form in the first season, but none of this stuff all working together as like the Reign of the Supermen. So this is the first time we have seen this part of the story really adapted. And like you said, like, I think this one is the one that I think suffered a little bit more from the New 52 stuff as opposed to the first part.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting is this was written by a different screenwriter. And I think I had a different director as well. And I like it because I like Steel. He's a character that I really, because to me, Steel represents like the best form of like what Superman stands for, where somebody else is taking up a responsibility to do good and put themselves out there. So I really like John Henry Irons in this, and I like how they kind of mix the two like origins of him being the construction worker, but also having the scientist military background. And I like that, you kind of have John Henry and Lois partner up.
Yes.
And then,
yeah.
I really like the look of this Superboy, because I like that they took the color scheme of that 90s Connor, but then they also mixed it a little bit with the suit of how they had it in the New 52. And I thought they found a good way of blending those two designs into one. We don't have the black t-shirt, red symbol, Connor, but I feel like I really like the way he looks in this compared to that original Connor look. I
agree completely. I think Connor's look is probably my favorite of all of them. The the way that I didn't even realize it at first. Like, and when I first saw this image of him, like, oh, they're just doing like a modern spin on the classic '90s suit. But then when I was watching it, and I didn't even notice on my first watch too, when I was rewatching it for this episode, I was looking closely. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, that is basically the new 52 design. It's just like covered up with the leather jacket. So I thought that was a nice little twist. And also because they could play more, and this wasn't planned originally. This was a retcon where the idea that Lex Luthor used his own DNA for Superboy as well, mixing it with Superman's. So having him work with Lex right off the bat and having Lex come right out and say, like, this is my Superman, I created him, type of thing, I thought was a really interesting way to do that. And because in the comics, right, this was when Lex Luthor was posing as his red bearded, long haired Australian long lost son, which is comics, folks.
yeah. And that goes back to cleaning up the storyline. And I mean, they even give you a great hint because Superboy's eyes are gray. Lex's eyes are gray. Superman's are blue. Lois's are purple because, it's an animated feature. They can, tweak things like that. So they even play around with it. If you're paying attention, you see, like he's got Superman's DNA, but he also has Lex, like the eyebrows. And like I said, the eyes are very Lex Luthor like. But I like that, he does get the moniker of Superboy. And I'll be honest, I have never liked the tactile telekinesis. To me, it didn't really make sense. I always liked the idea that Superboy, being a half human, half Kryptonian clone, had all of Superman's powers, but he was less powerful because of that. Or like what they did in Young Justice, where he had all Superman's powers, but he couldn't fly. In that series, he could leap and everything, much like Golden Age Superman, but he couldn't fly. And that incorporated into the story at certain beats. But I've never liked the tactile telekinesis.
Yeah, I totally get that complaint. But again, this was this weird thing they were doing in the 90s where Superman was supposed to be the only Kryptonian. So any other members of the super family, they had to have powers that weren't too Kryptonian or were just kind of Kryptonian-ish, but not enough. Like kind of like, again, with the Matrix Supergirl type of thing. Or here we have, and Superboy with the tactile telekinesis. So it was a really weird... DC hung on to that mandate from John Byrne for a very long time, even long after he left. Too long, in my opinion, actually.
I agree, because it wasn't until the late 90s with Jeff Loeb that we got Supergirl correctly reinstated. So,
yeah.
Was it late 90s or early 2000s?
I believe.
Right.
I think it was
early 2000s, actually.
I believe, yeah. I think the Superman Batman stuff, I believe that was early 2000s. Yeah, because Y2K was like 2000. That predated that stuff.
Yeah.
Also, too, one of the things too about Superboy that I liked here is they found a way to explain why he's like so 90s influenced. It's because Dabney Donovan loves all this 90s TV shows and he keeps feeding them to Superboy. So Superboy's only context for pop culture is the 90s. I thought that was a really cool twist.
It is, because it is just more of things that they do well in this story and telling it, and then I think where it starts to kind of fall apart, not really fall apart, but things that I'm not as keen on, is when you get that the cyborg Superman's trying to win everyone over and he gives them basically apocalyptic technology to regular people, and sends the whole Justice League away.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's just basically Steel and Superboy trying to figure out what to do.
Also, the whole thing about the Eradicator being a hologram, I thought was a weird thing, because it's just, I'm not quite sure how that really works. So.
It's crypto. It's weird, but I like it just because the Eradicator gets very confusing. The idea that it's just basically a hard light program that's there to gain energy to help, heal Superman. It works in the story. It makes it more simplistic for your audience who are just watching compared to people who've read these intricate comic book stories. And I feel like if there's one character in the reign of the Superman that we can kind of shortchange, the Eradicator's the one.
Yeah,
Like,
that's fair. I've always had a soft spot. Like ever since I first saw that design, though, I've always had a soft spot for that design of the character, though.
Oh, I think it's a great design. But yeah, I just feel like because you have Superboy, and what sucks is I really like Superboy in this, but he doesn't get to appear in anything else. He's seen in a frame of Darkseid War, but we don't actually get to see him interact because he goes off to join the Teen Titans and stuff. But we don't get anything else with him out after this.
Yeah, it's kind of a missed opportunity that we didn't get like another Teen Titans movie or something where, I mean, seeing him I know, in the comics, obviously it's him and Tim have the bromance, but it would have been interesting to see like maybe a mix of like the John and Damian and Tim and Connor dynamic and kind of mix it with Connor and Damian instead. Because they both have similar kind of brash personalities. So I think that would have been fun to play around with in a Teen Titans movie.
I think if I remember correctly, we were supposed to get, I think, another Teen Titans movie, and I think maybe another Justice League movie, or there was like one or two more movies we were supposed to get before Darkseid War, but then they rushed it, and didn't. So we set up new stuff that never really got paid off because I don't know if they wanted to rush this universe's end or what, but yeah.
Because this came out after Justice League Dark, and then the ones that came after this were we had Batman Hush, and then we had Wonder Woman Bloodlines, which I never saw that one, and then we had Justice League Dark Apocalypse War. So like all the stuff that is set up for Darkseid at the end of this, like with Lex Luthor joining the team and the team ready to go off and fight Darkseid, that's just kind of like rushed into the beginning of Apocalypse War so that they can then focus on the Justice League Dark team.
And Bloodlines is interesting, but Bloodlines is a weird movie in the sense that if you watch it, it very much feels like this was Wonder Woman's story leading up to Justice League War. So it almost feels like you just move that to the front if you're watching in a continuity like timeline. But yeah, it just Hush and then the end, which was Apocalypse War.
So I guess maybe this was because this came out in 2019, and then I guess at this point the writing was kind of on the wall for this series, and they had kind of made the decision that we're not going to keep this thing going, so we're just going to kind of start wrapping it up. And I'm guessing that was probably after Hush, because Hush came out the same year of this, and then Bloodlines also came out in 2019. But then Apocalypse War came out in 2020. So I'm guessing maybe the reception for these wasn't so good. So they just kind of like rushed things into Apocalypse War instead as a way of like tying everything together and then going into the Tomorrowverse reboot.
I don't know. I'd love to talk about it with, some of the people that were behind it all, because I felt like they were slowly adjusting, like with this film, and, working it and changing it and making it better. But getting back to just the Reign part, they do the Cyborg Superman story as Hank Henshaw, who's basically very much in a Superman body that resembles more of the New 52 Cyborg Superman, which I was okay with because we were still in that era, and it helps separate him from, because I wouldn't want him to be too classic Superman, not having classic Superman's look in this story. But he's basically in this was created by Darkseid and is being used by Darkseid. And that's one of the biggest differences in this story is you bring in Darkseid and make him a major player, which ties it back to, like we said, Justice League War.
Which that part I wanted to talk about. What did you think of that whole idea of having Darkseid behind not only the Cyborg Superman, because he's also mentions that he sent Doomsday.
Yeah. So
what do you think of that side of it?
I was fine with it because I'm looking at it in the context of this ongoing universe story. Because it makes a little bit more sense of how Doomsday gets there and why Doomsday's there. Because if you go back to Justice League War, they had Superman locked up and were turning him to a parademon. So it makes sense how Darkseid would have gotten Kryptonian DNA to make something that's Kryptonian based as a killer, as a killing machine. So I feel like it's one of those things that just works when you're writing long story, interconnected universe type films compared to comics. Because I've always had kind of this, I don't want to say issue with the fact that, Doomsday is Kryptonian. Like, it was kind of one of those, like, because then it makes it feel like the universe gets smaller, and then they've spent time trying to explain why and how and what Doomsday is and everything. And, eventually just make peace with it. Because when he came into the comics, it was a mystery. And where did this come from? What is this? It's just a killing machine. At least with this having the dark side part, it was engineered, to be a Kryptonian killer. And it works.
No, that's a good point. And, I was thinking about it, and I guess I'm not as the whole him controlling Darkseid thing maybe doesn't, I don't know. I do like the idea, but I also agree with you on the Kryptonian thing. Like, I think the fact that they made Doomsday this Kryptonian thing that ends up conveniently in the same place as the last survivor of Krypton is, kind of a hat on a hat type of thing. So it is pushing things a little bit too much. I would have liked the idea if he was just like some, creature from some like lost civilization that was here centuries ago and then broke free, and just like something that's completely unconnected to Superman, I think would have worked better. But at the same time, I like the idea of Doomsday being like this unstoppable force of nature that just happens. Like this, it's kind of a way of just like bad things just happen sometimes, and not even Superman can stand against them. And I think having Darkseid be an architect behind Doomsday kind of saps a little bit of that energy from it. Also too, with him being, and I get why they do it. Like you said, they're in this midst of this Darkseid story, so it makes sense to tie all this into Darkseid, especially using him and Apocalypse instead of Warworld and Mongol. Totally makes sense, and it makes it easier for people to understand, because if people have no memory of the comics, they're not going to know anything about Mongol, they're not going to know anything about Warworld, so that stuff's all going to be very confusing for them. Having it all be tied back to Darkseid does make a lot of sense, but at the same time, I think it does rob Henshaw of some of his agency as a character when Darkseid's the one being like the master puppeteer.
Yeah, it just makes him the psychotic like puppet that he was just there as Darkseid's puppet. He was there to try to fool everyone to believe that he was Superman, to be this kind of Superman until Darkseid could arrive, and he was just, his minion, his herald kind of thing there until Darkseid could, because it's because of what Henshaw does with those people that he's able to open the Mother Box portal big enough to bring his armada. And it's because of Henshaw that he's able to do that. So, but yeah, I mean, I think if you were to actually try to do the comic as it is, you would need to do it as a ongoing animated, almost cartoon series, because because like you said, the Reign story, because I mean, you get into Cyborg Superman, destroying Coast City, and there's a lot more to it, because you get, 4 characters that all have their whole stories that are interconnected. And I think this does a good job of hitting those high beats. Yeah. Because I would say in this version of the Reign, there's more originality, because you are tying it to the ongoing universe. Then the death is pretty straightforward. It hits what it needs to.
I also like that when Superman came back in the black suit and everything, I like that they gave, I wish they went full on beard, but I do like that they at least gave him a 5 o'clock shadow, because that's something that, going back and rereading that story, why would his hair grow long, but he wouldn't have any facial hair then when he's coming out of the stasis thing? So I think if we had gotten like the bearded black suit Superman from like the Superman and Lois, the Lois and Clark comic series, I think would have been really cool.
I love that comic series.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Same thing with, I was disappointed when they didn't do that too. Like when they did Justice League and they had to spend or when they reshot Justice League and they had to spend all this money CGIing Cavill's mustache away, just give him a full beard and that makes sense for the type of story you're telling.
But say he's not in the movie long enough for us to complain. And giving him a full beard because it makes more sense. Let's be honest. We all know that after death, your body still, for a short while, hair and fingernails still grow.
Especially because he's not. I mean, his hair still keep growing, obviously. Yeah. So it doesn't make any sense why he wouldn't have any facial hair. So I like they at least gave him a 5 o'clock shadows. I thought that was nice.
And they do a great job with the story where you have Superman with Superboy and Steel coming out of the fortress, and Superman goes to save Lois from Henshaw. Lex is able to free the Justice League from where Henshaw had, sent them. And Superman's depowered and he's fighting. And then we see that he actually has the Eradicator in a crystal that he shoves into Henshaw's head. And that's how he's able to defeat him. It all plays out very nicely, and Lois is like, looks at him like, the last secret. What is it? What was it? And he's like, I love you. Because Cyborg Superman had no recollection of the romantic side of Lois and Clark. And I thought she knew it really wasn't him.
Yes. Yeah. And also you had mentioned before the Steel and Lois teaming up thing. I agree. I thought that was a really cool beat to add to it because it gives Lois something more to do than just like, pining over Clark or just like trying to just chasing cold leads basically the whole time. Like here, it gives her an investigative angle to pursue and it gives her something more to work with. So I really like that aspect of it. Also too, so when like you mentioned that they give him the rebirth suit, were you disappointed at all that we didn't get the mullet as well?
It's funny, but I was fine with the long hair while he was in the black suit, but yeah, I'm glad he cut it. Because, okay, just for context, I'm part of a group of people who do a podcast called Electric Mullet, where we started reading Superman comics, starting with John Byrne's Man of Steel straight, through, and we're in the early 90s right now. And over on Krypton Report, we just recently read the Wedding album because it's been so long since I actually read it. And I was like, I don't even remember if I actually read the whole thing. And in that whole book, my biggest problem was Clark has a ponytail because he's pulled his hair back. And I just kept like, it just kept bothering me so much. And at the end of that, when he cuts it, I was like, whew. So the fact that he has long hair here in the black suit, perfectly fine. When he dons it back as regular Superman, it's short. Good job.
Yeah. And I thought the rebirth suit was a nice touch there as well at the end. And also there's one other big omission from this movie. I mean, it makes sense why they did it just because they had so much stuff to deal with. But, we have no Supergirl in this movie, and she was a pretty big part of the Reign of the Supermen stuff. Did you feel her loss at all, or do you feel like they should have found some way to use her, or do you think this worked fine without her?
I think it worked fine without her because that would have been another thing. Because if you're looking at this as the ongoing continuity, we hadn't got to Supergirl yet.
Yeah.
And that hadn't been introduced at all. And I don't think we ever do. We don't ever get a tease for her. No, we don't. Because I had to think for a second, because when they brought Young Justice back, they took a lot of the character design and models from this style and put them in there, I think just to help save money with some of the designs and the animation. And that show, the last season, teases Supergirl on Apocalypse. Spoilers, it's been over for like a couple of years. But so yeah, we never got to Supergirl at all in this. So not having Matrix, definitely a plus, because that's just convolution.
Yeah.
Not having Supergirl at all, it works because I feel like that takes away from the Reign characters we're introducing. Had this continued, I would have liked the next Superman solo film to be Supergirl showing up. Much more like the Jeff Loeb story.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like, in fact, I didn't even remember that Supergirl was not a presence in this movie, and didn't even feel that missing until after rewatching it and then thinking, like, oh yeah, that's right, Supergirl did play a pretty big role in that story. But it makes sense here. Okay, so I think that's. Is there anything else you wanted to say about Death and Return of Superman?
I mean, there's a lot more we could break down, but the highlights. No, I think we got it. I mean, like I said, I really enjoyed this. I think they did it. They had a big task ahead, and they did a great job with the death. A very, very good job with the rain part. And it is probably the one I rewatch from that series the most. Because it works as part of the continuity, but also works as standing on its own. So,
yeah, I think this is definitely might possibly be the best of this animated universe. I think. I'd have to go back and rewatch all of them. I did think it was interesting how Diana makes a point of telling Lois the league's been stretched thin since Clark's death, when, back in the Justice League War, like, they had Shazam as part of the team too. So it's like, and he's nowhere in this. So I wonder, like, what happened to Shazam?
I agree with you, because the one thing is, some of these will pop in and there's been people that get added. Like Martian Manhunter got added, but we never got introduction to him. Hawkman was added, but we never got introduction. I think the last time we saw Shazam was in Thrones of Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
But part of it was because when they were developing Justice League War, it was at a time where the DC had to renegotiate some things with the Siegel estate, and they thought they might lose Superman for a while. So they were going to have Shazam in there as kind of their Superman powered character. And that's why he was in that, Justice League War. Because I've listened to the screenwriter talk about that. But yeah, like when we got here, like there's not even a dropped line or anything about where he's, and it's been so long since I've seen Justice League Dark Apocalypse War. I think I've only watched that movie once. I don't even remember if he's in it. Right as that movie came out, we did a huge kind of retrospective where I rewatched all of the continuity films. And we kind of ranked them and talked about it and went, beat by beat of who all was part of things. But I haven't, since Justice League Dark, I've only kind of nitpicked certain ones. And mainly it's been Superman.
Yeah, I'm just looking over the Wikipedia entry. He doesn't appear on the cast list on Wikipedia, which that's not always complete, but it's also not mentioned as like a cameo or anything like that. So I don't know if they had him at all in Justice League Dark. And I think it would have been interesting if they had just like some line or something like, we don't know what happened to Shazam. He just kind of disappeared or something like that, or whatever.
We can't reach him. Like even that, yeah. Like, okay, cool. Like,
yeah. So, but that did stand out. I mean, it's not a big thing. It's just something that did stand out to me on this most recent watch, is just like, well, if you guys are so stretched thin, why don't you ask the other guy who's got Superman-like powers?
Right. You set up these characters and you introduce these characters, but then all of a sudden they're gone without any explanation. Okay.
I also felt the Hawkman edition, I'm like, why is Hawkman here suddenly? And then we don't have Shazam. So that also kind of was threw me for a loop as well.
Yeah. And Martian Manhunter. The only thing I can say is like later when they do.
Oh, that's right. Martian Manhunter wasn't in. That's right. I forgot about that. You're right.
When they do the Clark Kent, like discovered or whatever, found alive, and you see where Martian Manhunter's playing Clark, and he's like a little bit shorter and trying to be a little bit thinner, so he's standing next to Superman. They don't look that much alike when he's being interviewed. I thought that was cool.
Yeah, yeah. Also, I think it was you'd mentioned how they. The ending also, we set up this idea of Lex Luthor joining the Justice League and them getting ready to go fight Darkseid. And that's also a missed opportunity, because I would have liked to see where that storyline was taken, how much of that they would have followed, like the Jeff Johns Darkseid War story.
Yeah, because I mean, it is, we're getting ready to go fight Darkseid, and then we go to Apocalypse Darkseid War, and basically they lost. And it's the outcome of that they're trying to fix. So it gives you that hope of like, we're going to go fight Darkseid, and then it's like, oh, they got their butts whipped.
Yeah, I mean, at least Infinity War gave us the story of how they lost the fight first, and it was given a lot of room to breathe, whereas this one just didn't really give us that room, and I guess they were just kind of like rushing things to get to a reboot. Okay, so I think that's a good note to end on. So Tyler, thanks so much for coming on again, and why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Just search for Krypton Report on all your favorite social media platforms. I know we have the podcast. We also are on YouTube. We do some YouTube specials. You'll see videos of us. All of our episodes on YouTube are both in video and just audio form. So, find us there. Follow us on your favorite social media. And if you're ever interested in joining us for a chat, send us an email at kryptonreportpod@gmail.com.
Okay, awesome. And we have links to that stuff in the show notes, so please make sure to check that out, as well as our other like sponsor links and everything. As for us, superherocinephiles.com is the website, Super Cinema Pod on the socials, which mostly just Blue Sky, although we do still post release announcements on the other platforms as well. And if you go to the website, you can also find out how to be a guest yourself, too. So you can get in touch with me and let me know if you want to come on, too. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks for listening to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. Superhero Cinephiles is produced by me, Percival Constantine. The show is created by myself and the late, great Derek Ferguson, our host emeritus. Visit us on the web at superherocinephiles.com to listen to past episodes or find out how you can be a guest yourself. Support the show by visiting our advertiser links or click the Buy Me a Coffee link on the website to make a one-time donation. We are Super Cinema Pod on both Instagram and Blue Sky, so please be sure to follow us. We'd also appreciate if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.